Okay, so you've seen how to create a route for the new event page. To make this app a little more interesting and usable, and to further demonstrate routing, let's add another page that lists all of the events. To do that, we're going to have to create a event list template, and the HTML for that is going to look like this. There's nothing really particularly interesting here. We just have a repeater that's repeating for every event, and then we just have bindings throughout here to the event. And we'll need a controller to go along with this page, so let's create a event list controller, and that's going to be very simple. Notice that all it's doing is it's calling event data get all events and assigning that to the events on the scope. So we're going to have to create this get all events method on event data. We haven't created that yet, so let's come over to our event data and create that method. That just looks like this. So notice that we're just going to call query on the resource. Query is basically like get, but it expects an array back. And notice that we're not sending an ID in like we are with the get method above. This is going to make a request to /data/event without passing in an ID. So let's go update our web servers to return all the events if no ID is passed in. Okay, here's our Node web server. If you're using IIS, we'll get to that in a moment. So we just want to add a new route like this. And that will call a getAll method on the controller. So let's go create that now. That method's going to look like this. You can see here that we're selecting all the files in the directory. And then down here, we're going to loop over all the files in the directory, read their contents, and append it all together into a JSON array. And then we'll return those results. And that's it for our Node server. Now let's go update our Web API application for those using IIS. Here's our Web API controller. Now let's just add this method to get all the events. So that's just going to loop over all the JSON files in the directory and append them all together into a JSON array. Now let's abstract our get method into a new method. And finally, let's have our get method call the appropriate method based on whether or not an ID is passed in. Okay, so if an ID is passed in, we'll return all the events. Otherwise, we'll return the single event. That should do it. Now let's build. Now both our web servers have an endpoint for returning all results. Since I'm using the Node server, I'm going to go stop and restart my server to pick up the new changes. If you're running IIS, just remember to build your solution. Okay, so now both of our servers should be able to handle this resource query. So we already created a template and a controller for our new event list page. And of course, we can't get to that template without a route, so let's go ahead and add that route. And that's going to be fairly simple. Looks like this. Okay, so that looks just like the other route that we created. So events is going to use the event list template and the event list controller. So now let's go look at our page. So if we go to our new route, if we go to events, then notice that we're getting nothing, and that's because we're getting an error because we have not yet added the event list controller resource to our index.html. So let's go add that. So we now have an event list controller. And I know that page also uses the filters, so let's go ahead and add that resource. Okay, now if we go and look at the page, that should render. There we go. Now we have a page that is listing each of the events. Right now, if I click on them, nothing happens because I haven't wired up any links, but we now have a nice looking page for listing all of our events. And let's go wire those up so that they link to the event details. So inside the event list page, inside this repeater, we're going to add a link that is going to link to the event route. And we're going to pass into that route an event ID. So we're just going to use an Angular expression in here. And this whole event thumbnail will be a link. If we were to just demonstrate that right now, you can see that it at least is a link. It's not going to work, but if I click on this, you can see that goes to event/1. So let's go, and it's going to look very similar. Just when the route is event slash, and then notice I'm putting :event ID. That's how you specify parameters in a route. We'll get into that in the next clip. And we're going to have a event details template and an event controller. So we already have those, but the event details template is still a page. Let's move that over so that it's a template, which means we need to get rid of this extra stuff in here. And we don't need the controller specified. Okay, so now we've got that page set up, and we already have the event controller. We had that before. So now let's go and take a look at our site. Let's refresh this page. Now when I click on one of these, notice I get the event page. But of course, every time I click on this, I'm not getting the event that I'm clicking on. You might remember in the prior module, we set up the event resource so that it always returns just event 1. So in the next clip, we'll show how to wire up this parameter that's being passed in and use that inside the controller. But one last thing that I want to point out that's happening here is as I navigate around each one of these, notice that I'm hitting back. And that's interesting because I'm not actually ever navigating to any new pages, so the browser wouldn't know to be adding things to the history. If I hold down my mouse here, you can see that I have several items in the history here. And as I navigate around to different places, I get more items in the history. So AngularJS is actually also taking care of managing our histories. It's an important thing in single page apps for that to work, because people are used to, when they're in a browser, if they click on something like this and it goes to what to them looks like a new page, they're going to expect to be able to hit back and go back to the prior page. And where we're not actually loading pages, we have to handle that, and Angular handles that for us, so that as we navigate from view to view, it adds those views to the history in the browser. So that's a little bit more about routing and history. Next, let's take a look at how to create a default route.